back in time to 2017. I'm a junior, sitting in the back of my College American classroom, and at the high school I went to, College American was seen as the most rigorous class a junior could take. It was dual high school and college credit, incorporated English and history together, and because of that had 2 teachers. And on the very first day of class, as my teachers went over the syllabus, it said in bold and underlined letters, absolutely no makeup exams will be given. Now, of course, one of my peers asked, well, what happens if we get sick? To which my teachers both responded, if you get sick, we expect you to be here. And if you're throwing up, I'll give you a garbage can. Now, I did find it a little odd that my teachers prioritized our attendance over our well-being, but we didn't question it. That was the culture. If you're sick, you show up to school. Now, I was never sick for any exams, but I did suffer one symptom that whole year that I still carry with me to this day, and that's fear. Afraid to miss work or school due to illness, I tend to push through when I'm feeling under the weather. And what I found is that this is a common thread amongst most people. In 2019, a management consulting company did a study. Robert Half surveyed 2,800 of their workers, asking them how often they went to work while feeling sick. The results? 9 in 10 of their workers said that they went to work feeling sick. Now, the reasons behind this varied. Number 1 being they felt like they had too much work to do, followed by not wanting to use a sick day, followed by pressure from their employer to be there. But regardless, most people went to work while feeling sick. My question is why this isn't a bigger issue. Why there's no social stigma behind showing up to work when you're sick. Well, it's likely because there's not a lot of stigma behind common infectious diseases. Let's take influenza, for example. It's a relatively common disease. The CDC reported an estimated 36 million people became infected in the 2018-2019 calendar year, with approximately 500,000 hospitalizations and about 34,000 deaths. If you can't do the fast math, I'll just tell you, that's a 0.1% death rate, approximately. Relatively small, right? But this disease is still highly infectious. It was the cause of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic, which infected nearly 1/3 of the world's population at the time and killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people. Lineages of this strain led to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, where an approximate 150 to 575,000 Americans died from this so-called swine flu. And yet, there are still extremely deadly strains of it, such as H5N1, known as the avian or bird flu, that has a case fatality rate of 60%. And while a little less than 50% of Americans get their flu vaccine every year, it's still common to show up to work when you're feeling under the weather. Why is that? Why is there no stigma behind this heavily, possibly deadly disease? Let's take a break from a less stigmatized, less feared disease and focus on one that's more so: HIV. Now, I wasn't alive during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but as a microbiology major who studies infectious diseases, HIV slowly became my favorite subject to learn about. It started as an extremely odd and rare disease that started coming up at about 1980 and seemed to only occur in gay men. Because of this, the stigma behind the disease seemed to be worse than the disease itself, despite the high mortality rate. Terms to describe this disease included the new leprosy, the gay plague, gay cancer, and was officially known as GRID for about a period of time, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. Homophobic and bigoted people saw HIV and AIDS as justified punishment for gay behavior, and some politicians actively lobbied against the funding for AIDS research. Because of the heavy stigma behind this disease and the terms used to describe it, they posed the answer to the common question, why me, with, well, because you're gay. A lot of people in authority and politicians turned a blind eye to the severity of this disease because in their eyes, the cure was simple. Stop being gay. It wasn't until heterosexual people started becoming more infected that it started getting the attention that it needed. By the end of 1981, about a year into the emergence of this disease, 121 people had died and hundreds, likely thousands, had already become infected. And yet, most of the media was silent. People in power stayed quiet. Funding records at the time showed that a life of a gay man with AIDS was worth 1/10 of a straight man with Legionnaire's disease. At first, a lot of gay people thought it was the repressive community trying to stop the gay liberation movement when they were trying to shut down bathhouses and warning against the transmission of this disease. There was a lot of fear behind HIV and AIDS because there was a lot of unknown. Most people at first didn't know how it was transmissible. People assumed that you only got it because you were gay, and if heterosexual people got it, it was because they were secretly gay. People were afraid to tell their family. People were afraid to seek medical care. One patient even recorded going to the doctor, finding out he had tested positive, and his doctor's exact response was that he should get his affairs in order. And it became heavily politicized. It took Ronald Reagan 7 years to publicly address the disease, and the stigmatization did not start to slow until well into the 90s. Now, there are 4 essential elements to stigmatized disease. Firstly, the stigma can lead to barriers against seeking medical treatment and care, which reduces early detection and early response, which is vital in disease prevention. Secondly, the stigma can lead to social marginalization and be a gateway towards poverty, neglect, and increased susceptibility of these populations to amplification of their disease. Thirdly, the stigmatized populations may begin to distrust health authorities and resist cooperation during a public health emergency. And finally, the social stigma may distort the public perception of risk, which can lead to a mass panic and disproportionate allocation of resources. Of course, we saw these elements in the HIV and AIDS epidemic, but we also see them in today's culture with COVID-19, especially in the past year. And whether or not you believe it, COVID-19 has become heavily stigmatized. Some people refer to it as the Chinese virus, and certain demographics have become heavily discriminated against, including healthcare workers that care for COVID patients, those who have gotten COVID and recovered, people of low socioeconomic groups, and even those who belong to specific racial identities. In Italy, like in other parts of the world, the feelings towards the Chinese community has completely changed. Chinese restaurants are left empty. Parents don't want their kids hanging out with their Chinese classmates. And even some high-profile politicians have aided in the stigma on national television. Stigmas also started to form from travel restrictions, facilitating xenophobia, and reinforcing social hierarchies by labeling it as a foreign invasion. And again, as seen with HIV, COVID became heavily politicized. The vaccine was seen as dangerous and untrustworthy, yet required and necessary. Mask mandates, social distancing, curfew hours were all put in place by those that govern the people. And yet, among the many symptoms associated with COVID-19, there is one that infected almost every citizen, whether they tested positive or not. Fear. It was something that was commonly seen in HIV, especially in the early stages. People didn't know how it was transmitted. People didn't know what caused it. But it seemed to have a really high mortality rate and there was no cure. Same thing happened with COVID. There was a lot of unknown. And when there's a lot of unknown, that's scary for most people. So you may be asking, what do we do? How do we limit the fear of infectious diseases and stop the stigma behind it? And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm only 20 years old. I don't study infectious diseases for a living. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a politician. I'm no expert in any field. I'm just a college student. So I'm honest in saying, I don't know. But the one thing that I do know is we need to make a change about the perception we have of all infectious diseases, both past perception and present. Because if you look at stigmatized diseases, like HIV and COVID, most of the times, the stigma is fueled by fear, and fear of the unknown. And if there's one thing I do know, fear of the unknown is worse than the unknown itself. Thank you.